This week, our third message in the series of these remarkable babies in our Advent series. We're going to look at Immanuel, the child that was promised by Isaiah to King Ahaz as a testimony that God is with the people. We looked, and I want to go back at the first two babies in our series because in many ways, this child Immanuel, the message that we're going to look at today, is a bridge between, first we were looking at Seth, who was the child establishing God's plans and purposes in the world. Seth's name, if you remember, was he establishes, or the Lord establishes. And we saw that in that passage, God is the one who establishes and restores. He's the God who keeps his promises. And we were called to a faith in that God. We were called to remember that God is faithful. He keeps his promises always. And then we took a look at our next passage, which was the son given to the woman who lived in Shunem. Elisha came and he promised a child, and then he also restored that child to life by the grace of God. It wasn't Elisha, it was God working through the prophet to restore the child to his mother, to bring him back to life. And we saw in that passage, we did a character study, a very brief and limited character study of the woman of Shunem, and we were challenged to commit ourselves wholeheartedly to doing what is right. On the one hand, we remembered that there is a God who keeps his promises. And on the other hand, we were reminded that we have been challenged now, and we set it out as our Christmas challenge for 2021, to commit ourselves, to devote ourselves wholeheartedly to doing what is right. And the bridge between those two messages is faith. What does faith call us to? We see God, we encounter God for who he is, and then we respond to God. Faith calls us into action. It's rooted in what we know as we encounter God. It is shaping how we feel. Because we have seen God, now we are changed and we feel differently about ourselves and the world around us. It's rooted in what we know, it shapes what we feel, and it motivates us now to action. That is what faith looks like. And we're going to look at a passage here, Isaiah chapter 7. We're going to look at two distinct encounters with the prophet Isaiah and the king Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7. And we're going to see as the baby Immanuel is promised. We're going to look at Ahaz today and look at his responses to these prophetic messages sent by the Lord through his prophet Isaiah. And it's important to notice that in Isaiah chapter 6, we hear the explicit call to the prophet. In fact, Isaiah chapter 6 says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." Just before we get to chapter 7 in the book of Isaiah, we are reminded that there is a king seated on the throne. He is Yahweh the Lord. He is the one with power and majesty. He is sovereign over all the earth. In fact, he is so great. His majesty is so great. His power is so great. His significance, his beauty, his holiness, they are all so great that the train of his robe, just the train of his robe, fills the temple. And so now we come to Isaiah chapter 7. And we get to fill in the historical details. If we were to read the historical books of our Old Testament, we'd see more of the details going on, the background of this story a little bit further, and we may touch on that a little bit. But let's focus on what it tells us about King Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7. Let's begin reading at the beginning of the chapter. "In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told, 'Syria is in league with Ephraim,' the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And the Lord said to Isaiah, 'Go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway of the washer's field. And say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, and the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria, the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, Let's go up against Judah and terrify it, and let's conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria. And the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. And he, that's Isaiah, said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you must weary God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he shall call his name Immanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the land of these two kings that you dread will be deserted. Our first and sort of overarching point is that faith calls us not to inaction nor to self-sufficiency, but to obedience and confidence that our destinies are in God's hands. Faith calls us not to inaction, not to passivity, not to step back. Nor does it call us to self-sufficiency as if it were all on us, as if we ourselves were the ones working and doing. It relies on our brains or our muscles or our courage or our confidence. No. It calls us neither to inaction nor self-sufficiency, but faith calls us to obedience and confidence that our destinies are in God's hands. And we begin to see how that's the bridge between knowing who God is and committing ourselves wholeheartedly to what is right and good. Well, notice there are two kings north of Judah, north of Ahaz, that are causing quite a bit of consternation for him and his people. And actually, this threat exists before Ahaz comes to the throne. He sort of inherits the changing international climate. What's going on in the world right now is Assyria is rising as a power. Assyria, we have two different similar sounding names. We have Syria, which is immediately north of Judah and Israel. And then we also have Assyria, which is further east. Assyria, whose capital is Nineveh, is rising in power. And these two smaller nations north of Judah, Syria and Israel, referred to as Ephraim, the most significant of the tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north. Syria and Ephraim have sort of allied themselves. Syria and Israel have banded together because they see the threat of Assyria on the horizon. And what they want is they want Judah to join them in a coalition to fend off their land. But Judah isn't as threatened. Their position geographically, they don't feel the pressure of Assyria as Israel and Syria do. And so these two kings that we hear in the passage here, Rezin and Pekah, they both want Judah to join them. And Judah says no. So their solution is that we will invade Judah as a coalition, and we will establish a puppet king. We'll put someone on the throne who will follow our lead. And of course, as Ahaz stands watching these international events develop, he is very concerned about it. Syria doesn't believe in Yahweh. They don't worship him. They don't serve him. So it shouldn't surprise us that when they see this foreign power rising up, they look for a human answer or a worldly response. It shouldn't surprise us at all. And I think that's important for us to notice as Christians, as believers living in the world in which we live now. When you look at how people around you respond to crisis and challenge, do not be surprised when they put their hope in things that will not satisfy. Don't be surprised when there is genuine heartache, When people are struggling to find purpose and meaning in their lives, that they hold on to things, that they reach for things that won't satisfy, that are as broken as they are, that are as faulty and flawed as they are. Don't be surprised when the pagan world runs away from God, the one they need, because that is what human beings do in a sin-sick world. Christianity is not a religion or a faith that says, just don't worry about the world. Just, shut your eyes, hum a tune, and be happy all the time. Let the world burn around you. That's not at all what Christianity says. In fact, Jesus is constantly calling us to a genuine love for those around us, and in particular, those who are lost, those who are in trouble. He calls us into those dangerous, dark situations because the love of Christ compels us forward. Because we have been loved, we are called to love. And as we see heartache around us, we are to grieve with those who grieve and bring the gospel of Christ into those situations. And we should go out into the world preaching the good news that Jesus brings hope, that Jesus is the God who keeps his promises, and Jesus is the one that satisfies, the water that when you drink, you will never be thirsty again. We should have a heart for the lost. And yes, condemnation will come. Condemnation will come. Judgment is coming. But judgmentalism is not what God has called us to. So we see this king of this northern country outside the bounds of the promised land, outside the promise of God. And it shouldn't surprise us that he is behaving as he does. However, what is truly tragic is that the people of Israel, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, has resorted, instead of faith in God, they have sought the strength of people, and pagan people, no less. You see, from its very beginning, the northern 10 tribes struggled to have faith in God. And all of their kings seemed to put their trust and act as if God was not enough, as if going beyond the bounds of his promises was how they would eventually find their hope. And they had the promise of God. They had been given the promise of God. They too were children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet they didn't trust him. They had abandoned their hope in Yahweh, and that is a truly tragic thing. We see that in Israel. These northern 10 tribes that have forgotten that God is the one who will keep his promises always. And so now we come to the southern kingdom of Judah. And we see that Isaiah has two messages for these people. The first is, don't be afraid. We are told in verse 2 that the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as trees in the forest shake before the wind. They are terrified by what is happening in the world around them. Isaiah brings the message, don't be afraid. He's told by the Lord to go out and meet Ahaz. And the message is, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands and the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria and the son of Remaliah. In fact, God is so confident, or he wants to instill in his king and his people the confidence that he will be their helper, that he doesn't even refer to the king of Israel by his name. The idea here is, have you ever stirred a campfire with a stick? And when you pull the stick out, there's like a glowing hot ember at the end of your stick, and if you wave it around, it sort of smokes and smolders, but the stick itself doesn't catch fire and catch flame. The idea here of these two kings is like that stick you've used to stir the fire, and they glow and there's smoke, but there's really no life and heat. They're not about to spark into flame. They're really glowing embers that will soon be extinguished because they don't have the heat and the vitality. There's not the power of the fire in them to carry out what they had planned. The first message to Ahaz is, don't be afraid. God has a purpose and a plan. You are his. And the tragedy of that first message is, Ahaz doesn't respond at all. It shall not stand, the Lord says. This is verse 7. And it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in your faith, you will not be firm at all. If you do not stand in faith, you will fall. And that is the invitation, but there is no response from the king. And as we pick it up in verse 10, we see that another message comes, and it seems very clear. Ahaz has not really believed the message the Lord sent. So Isaiah arrives, and again the Lord speaks to Ahaz. And he says, I want you, Ahaz, to pick a sign. I want you to give name it. You name it. It can be as high as heaven or as deep as the depths of the earth. Go down into the place of the dead. Anything between heaven and hell. And you name it. And I will do it as a sign to you that I am the Lord and my purposes will stand. And there's a sort of false piety here, where Ahaz refused to respond in the first case. He did not reply to the promise of salvation. In the second case, he actually steps back and shows off, well, who am I to demand a sign of the Lord? I won't put God to the test. There is no request given, and his piety is a cover-up for his doubt and self-confidence. Most commentators point to the fact that Ahaz is putting a show of righteousness forward. He says, oh, no, it's not right for me to do this. But really, what he wants is a back door, a way out. He has made his plans. He has established sort of his defenses. He's got his plans in place. In fact, his hope is actually in the threatening nation that lies outside of the borders of this contested area. He is hoping that Assyria and Egypt will come to his rescue. Little does he know Assyria is coming with judgment on God's people. He's got his plans in place, and the last thing he wants is a visible, tangible sign from God that he needs to abandon those plans. And so Isaiah continues, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little to weary men that you will weary my God also? Notice that in the first case, it is an invitation to your God. Ahaz is the one who belongs to God, or that God belongs to Ahaz. But in the second case, now as Isaiah continues to speak, it is no longer your God, but it is my God, the God of Isaiah. Must you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us. There's a little bit of ambiguity as to who this child actually is, who the woman is. Most likely, there is some young lady within the royal court of Judah that is being indicated by Isaiah. Whoever it is, the king knows, Isaiah knows, everyone listening knows who this is. And there's a child coming who will stand as a witness and a testimony to the fact that these two kings you are so worried about, they'll be gone. Their lands laid waste. And God is going to accomplish it. And that child stands as a testimony and a witness to the fact that God has made his promise, God will keep his promise, and it comes as a clarion call saying you must now live by faith or you will fall in your doubt and disbelief. Of course, we, as New Testament believers, also understand that Immanuel, the statement God with us, was intended not only to apply to Ahaz and his day, but is for all who will come to faith in Jesus. Because Jesus has come, God with us, Immanuel. And the salvation promised here looks forward to the salvation we now receive because of the cross of Christ. Because the empty tomb stands as a testimony that he is alive and he is able to bring with him the reward that has been promised, our inheritance in heaven. As we read these passages, it is so important we recognize that faith calls us not to inaction. It's not as if building defenses for your city as you see the army approaching. That is not wrong. so long as the defenses themselves do not become your confidence. Faith calls us not to inaction, nor to self-sufficiency. But faith calls us to obedience and confidence that our destinies are in God's hands. Here's the point, the exclamation point. Do what God commands and trust him with the results. Do you hear how that bridges our two messages from our first two children? God is the God who restores and establishes. He keeps his promises always. We know who he is, and that therefore calls us to commit ourselves to doing what is right. When we do what God has commanded, we can trust him with the result. Let me read for you Psalm 37. I'm going to read verses 3 to 5. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord and trust in him. He will act. What if we delighted ourselves in the Lord intentionally with purpose because he's commanded it? What if my free time was spent delighting in the Lord and trusting that I won't miss those things I could have taken up instead? What if I devoted myself to delighting in the Lord and trusted that I miss out on nothing? Trusting that at the end I will look back and say, wow, this was the best. I gave up good things, but this, the best thing, I lost none of it. I've been recognizing that some of the things I spend my time on, they are removed from my delight in the Lord. In fact, they take away from my delight in the Lord. And I need to genuinely and honestly look at how I spend my free time. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. I don't know what it is for you. I don't know what the challenge is for you. But this I promise. When we do what God commands, we can trust him with the result. Maybe there's some threat on your horizon, just like the people of Judah had a threat on theirs. Maybe there's some concern, some worry, some heartache. Do what God has commanded and trust him with the result. Don't be anxious. In fact, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, and the peace of God that surpasses understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Do what God has commanded and trust him with the result. Ultimately, that's what faith is. It is our confident hope that as we see God for who he is, the God who restores and establishes, the God who keeps his promises always, that knowledge of God, when we become rooted in that, will shape how we feel about the world around us. And as we act on it, as it becomes the motivation for our action, we will see God at work in